Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. First of all, on behalf of the entire DocShifter team, we want to wish you a very warm welcome to our second webinar of the year. And our special thanks go today to a number of people. I'm reading here: James, Aaron, Sarah, Bertrand, Jens, Caroline, Paulina, Kim, David, Josh, without mentioning them all, who have been keeping us busy actually by submitting questions or specific questions. We'll try to address as many of those as we can today, but a very big thank you for not only for joining, but also for sending us those questions. Since we only have a half hour for this webinar, I propose we dig right into it because we promise we will finish it on time. Agenda in a nutshell: Paul Ireland will take you through the existing compliant PDF preparation processes, just to give you a view of how things are in general done today. And then subsequently look at how this whole process can be automated, so how it can be done faster, more efficient, etc. Looking at first for an individual health authority, and then seeking even more progress, looking at multiple health authorities submissions all at once. We'll summarize it with some benefits and end the presentation with a quick poll. So again, my name is Geert. Paul is our next speaker up. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. And Paul, yeah, maybe before I go there, just quickly, who are we? So DocShifter is a software company focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is helping to automate file format conversion. So we have developed a platform to do any-to-any digital file format conversion. And of course, we want to thank also here today our many customers around the globe, without whom our development and our progress would not be possible. So again, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who's in the UK right now, where it's probably raining. Paul, over to you.
Great, thank you, Gerd. And yes, welcome from London, or hello from London, as they like to say in Eurovision. Hopefully it'll be more than 0 point this evening. So hello, everybody, and thanks again for your time. As Gerd mentioned, what I want to do first is begin by going through some of your existing processes, or what typical processes for creating and preparing your submission-ready content. Obviously focusing on some of the specific problem areas, and then how they could be addressed through automation in platforms like DocShifter. So I'll start initially with a very typical current document lifecycle process, taking a document from its initial stages of being authored in tools like Word or different Office platforms, kind of going through various review cycles and updates within your document management environment. At various points in its lifecycle, those documents are typically converted to PDF. And that PDF is often then prepared further. At that point, you use additional tools to finalize the PDF before it gets included into a submission or submissions. At various points, you do a draft publish. And at that point, at the end, you get to validate not only the submission, but typically that includes obviously content-related checks as well. That's obviously for an individual document. Taking the same thing across multiple health authorities, same thing, authoring and reviewing the content works the same way. Obviously, rendering to one format, typically will be to one format, but if it's going to multiple health authorities that have slightly different requirements, obviously, typically that may not be to meet all of their requirements. So you typically have one spec met, and then in the preparation stage, you may prepare the individual PDFs that will then feed into the different dossiers, kind of moving forward as well as part of the publishing process. Obviously, those multiple dossiers are then drafted and then validated individually. Obviously, the more content, the more health authorities you're submitting to, obviously, the more complex and more long-winded this becomes. Obviously, just maybe to go through in a little bit more detail, kind of those steps as well. So just taking an example using 3 source documents, just taking 3 documents that need to be used across 5 different countries. You're submitting to 5 countries, just these 3 documents for now. So what it means is those 3 documents have to be rendered typically to PDF. They get converted. but often, again, those PDFs need a lot of manipulation. So in this case, I'm looking at a scenario of submitting or preparing these documents, PDFs, to be included in an FDA submission for the US, a European one for the EMA, Japan to the PMDA, Swissmedic for Switzerland, and Health Canada for Canadian submission. And I have to do that for each of the documents as well. So typically already at 15 steps at that point. So generating, preparing those PDFs. Obviously, that step in itself has lots of steps and lots of things that you need to do and accomplish as well within it. Obviously, you have to check that those are submission ready. So you may perform various analysis, making sure that before you include those documents into a submission, they're actually truly submission ready, and actually resolve any issues you may find with them as well. They then get included into the relevant dossiers. So again, the US documents get included in the US, etc. And at some point in time, you then build a draft of that submission for the 5 different markets that you're intending to submit to. You validate, you resolve any issues, and that may involve, depending on the issue, going back to the original content potentially, or just going back to fine tune in whatever tools you use for PDF manipulation to make additional tweaks and include the updated version in the dossier as well. At some point, you republish and go through your repeat until basically final. What it means is, even if you went straight through the process just with 3 documents and so only 5 health authorities, you're already looking at 86 steps if you were to go straight through. And again, within each of those steps, there's typically a lot of sub-steps as well. And if you had to just make 1 revision, for example, per document, you're looking at about 116 steps. So again, this becomes an extremely complicated, very time-consuming, long-winded process if it's all done manually. You may have tools to automate some of it or to perform some of these a little bit more quickly, but typically a lot of the steps are still performed in some form of manual or batch mechanism. Obviously, typically that's handled by Reg Ops, so they have the headache of having to prepare the content, obviously ensure that you're not missing any deadlines because content's still coming in, still needs to be manipulated. You obviously try to source additional tools to help streamline that process as much as possible as well, until you get the types of things they're looking at are in Word documents identifying issues already at the source. So it can be at the PDF stage. It may be that its medical writers are also involved in this stage as well, but identifying issues in the source documents, manually looking for, are there still web links included? Do you have any blue text that isn't a hyperlink? Do you have any incorrect sequence numbers or in heading titles, etc.? Do you have tables that aren't fitting the page correctly and using fonts that are too small? Fonts not being embedded in the right way in Word, for example, and which could cause further problems down the line once everything is converted over to PDF as well. So they begin obviously manually identifying issues, resolving them in Word. Same thing in PDF, obviously identifying issues, whether the bookmarks are correct. Do you have the right number of levels of bookmarks? Are they open to the correct level? Are your hyperlinks the right color? Do you have any that remain black or red or whatever color the authors actually included them originally? Do you have any blue text that remains that isn't actually a hyperlink? It's just in blue text. It's maybe left as a placeholder. Somebody hasn't added a hyperlink there yet. Hyperlinks may not be set to inherit zoom, etc. So various things that they look for throughout the PDF file. Same thing with the properties. Are your properties set in the PDF file? Is it the right PDF version? Is the file size too large for the health authority in question? And has it been optimized for fast web view according to the guidelines? Same thing with fonts embedding. They've been embedded. All the fonts used in the document, have they all been embedded? Identifying where there are issues there can be quite tricky. And obviously we'll look at how that could be automated as well. Same thing, when you open the PDF or when the reviewer does, there's specifications for the initial view. Have they been set accurately as well? So these are just some examples of the types of things that they're looking for when they do analysis. Obviously, in terms of fixing it, you may have very manual methods using Acrobat tools to literally go edit hyperlink by hyperlink, bookmark by bookmark, modify where the zoom level is incorrect. In this example, just setting that to inherit zoom from whatever it was incorrectly set to previously. And often, as I say, they're very manual or completely manual or semi-manual processes using batch tools or other plugins that may do this across multiple files, but have to be invoked in some method as well. So not fully automated, sort of semi-automated. Same thing with here, just another example with the embedding fonts. Again, some of these things can be fixed in tools. They're just typically long-winded. It makes it a very long-winded process. So kind of how can we automate some of it? So that's fine. You've got all these things. You've got your ways of identifying issues, etc. as well. But obviously, the ideal thing is to be able to automate that. And what I'm going to focus on is how you can leverage the rendering technology to go beyond just what it's then known for, which is converting, from Word or Office to PDF, leveraging that technology in different ways to help you automate some of the things that you're doing manually today. So really look at rendering as beyond just a conversion tool. So obviously, in this case, you can bring in elements that you may have separate processes for. One, the compliance piece at the end, creating a fully compliant rendition is one part of what the rendering tool should be able to do for you. Should be able to create a fully technically compliant PDF right off the bat with less interaction. There'll always be times you need to do manual steps and have some manual specific use cases where you have to fix things by hand, of course. But a lot of it can be automated. A lot of things you're doing can be automated with the rendering tool as well. And to ensure that it's really technically ready, as if you've published the file, but at the rendering stage instead. But you can also incorporate things like your OCR automatically. So as it's rendering, if it's a PDF or a scanned image, you can automatically OCR the file to make it a searchable, text searchable rendition according to the guidelines. You can apply headers and footers and pagination and watermarks if you're in draft stage, etc. as well. Merge multiple documents together, apply detailed bookmarking, including kind of custom styles, for example, as well, which I'll get to later, and not just your typical heading levels that you find in a Word document, but also any custom styles you're using in your own template as well, should be able to convert automatically, correctly in the PDF rendition while you render the file. Tables of contents should be generated, can be automated as well. So if you have files over a certain number of pages, you should be able to have them inserted automatically as part of that process as well. And any security stripped out to make sure you're not sending any kind of restricted PDFs to any health authority. Part of that as well can include some validation steps as well, to actually check the content either before you even convert it, checking the Word document for any issues in the Word document. And our previous webinar touched on that in a lot more detail. But we had obviously the ability to take the Word documents, check it, fix the file, render the fixed file as well, all automatically without any human steps involved in there. And at the end of it as well, once you have a PDF, to create a checklist telling you that the file meets all of your expectations. Check it against, it's the right version, you've got no issues with hyperlinks, bookmarks, etc. You can automate that checking process as well through the workflow within the rendering tool. Just to show you what that could look like as an example in an actual workflow. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm just looking at a SharePoint repository, and the SharePoint repository is being monitored that for whenever a document reaches a certain status, once we check a box to say this document needs rendering, basically what we're going to do is we're going to take one of three routes depending on the file type. And it's going to touch on some of the points I showed you that can be incorporated. So we've got basically, if you've got the right-hand route, and again, I haven't changed this, the right-hand route is actually for zip files, not for PDF. The right-hand route is ultimately, if you've got a zip file, we're going to merge all the documents together into one single big PDF file. We're going to generate a table of content at the beginning of the TOC and potentially at the beginning of each document within the zip file. We're going to add some overlays, maybe to add a watermark or headers, footers, pagination. And then we're going to create a compliant PDF out of it as well, make sure it's fully technically ready for the health authority in question, and then store the results back out into SharePoint. If it was a PDF file, we'll take the center route, we will OCR the file, we'll add an overlay, we'll do the HiFi compliant PDF transformation. In this case, we'll also validate the PDF and create a validation checklist against it. And for everything else, whether it's a Word document, Excel, image format, whatever it may be, we're going to basically just do a fully compliant transformation. And then we're going to validate the PDF at the end and then release the results out into SharePoint. Okay, so it kind of shows you how workflow can incorporate more than just a step to convert to PDF. You can bring in a lot of other elements into it. And this is still a pretty simple example, just creating one single variant, one single output. We'll look at some more complex ones for dealing with multiple health authorities next. Obviously, part of that as well, and I'm not going to touch on this much here because we had the previous webinar, as I say, can be checking the content as well as converting it and dealing with the conversion correctly. It can be actually fixing the Word content as well. So we can go through and perform some simple fixes, to remove, empty paragraphs and fix sequence numbers in the headings, etc. as well. But there's a lot more detail about that in our previous session. So one example being here, I've got some white spaces in the headings, some empty paragraphs, numbers that are out of sequence, tables not set to fit the page, etc. as well. And as part of that rendering process, fully automatically, those issues could have all been resolved, along with a number of others. These are just some examples. As I say, the headings, white spaces are all removed, the numberings corrected, empty paragraphs removed, etc. as well, and the table fitting the page. Same thing with PDF. Again, this is just a whole series of checks that you can perform to make sure to check that the PDF is actually compliant. Without having to process it at all, you could just run a checker to say, show me whether or not this PDF is technically ready already, without having to include it in a submission or run a submission validation. You're actually able to check the PDF before it ever even enters it, or even begin to create the submission. You can already check that that PDF is technically compliant already as well, through a series of checks that you can perform automatically as part of your rendering workflow. And again, a whole series of checks in there, bookmark related, hyperlink, etc. And then the results can be either, to go through the flow and fix some of them, or a report that basically lists all the results, whether or not optimization isn't set, it's the right PDF version. You may have some text that are blue and not hyperlinked, etc. So resulting report at the end of it. What I want to look at a little bit though is obviously, as well as obviously what it can do for individual documents in terms of rendering, kind of how it can help you support multiple health authorities, how you can take an individual document that you need to use in different health authorities submissions automatically as well. So taking that concept of what we can do individually, making it fully technically compliant, but across, for multiple health authorities automatically. So looking at this process again, similar to what we had before, ideally what we're looking to achieve is take the 3 source documents that we had before from the previous example. The creation stage of rendering those to fully compliant PDFs should be automatic, and it should know automatically when the renditions are required. And you should just be focusing on creating the content, obviously deciding which health authorities it needs to be submitted to, and then the tool should automatically be rendering all of the relevant renditions in the background for you. And again, with no human interaction and without the need after the one PDF rendition is created to create the individual ones from that master PDF and kind of tweak one. That should no longer be necessary. We then we have all the final PDFs kind of ready that then can get included in the submission. You may always have to do some manual tweaks. That's not to say you can completely bin all of your manual tools. There's always going to be the odd case where you need to fix things that can't be done, can't be fixed automatically. They need some human interaction, but we can reduce it significantly in this case. Include all the individual documents in the relevant submissions. They obviously, same final steps, draft, publish, obviously validate the submission, resolve any issues, again, potentially going back in the process. Final, really from a tool that doesn't automatically create these fully compliant, fully technically compliant PDFs. And if you're adding an individual steps, obviously the more you're updating, the more you're having to do that across multiple documents as well. So again, roughly down to 73 steps, roughly again about a 40-step saving. So some of the ways in which we can automate workflows. So there's a few different options that you have available, and we'll talk on some of them. I'll use one example a little bit later. So I will focus on the task data option, which is kind of creating automation depending on leveraging your document management system and the attributes of your document management system to decide when something should take place or what exactly should take place. Looking to say, should I have an FDA rendition? Should I have an EMA rendition? Should I have a PMDA rendition? Which regions do I need to create it for? We can hopefully leverage metadata from your DMS to accomplish that fully automatically. So that's one example we'll look at, not only the DMS, but also the document attributes itself as well. So documents, Word attributes, etc. as well. But there are some other mechanisms as well. We can kind of create automation based on whether or not the file has been signed. And Paulina asked a question about specific logic, depending on if the file, the PDF file, source file has a signatures applied. So you should be able to create routing to say, if the document is signed, then do this to it. potentially create a rendition that's updated to the latest specs or whatever is required from a regulatory perspective, and embed the signed document inside it, for example. If it isn't signed, it can just go through a regular flow and convert it as usual, for example. A template option, where we look at the template that's used by the document and say, depending on the word template in play, we will render it a different way. So if it's a template that you know is in use in Japan, you can say, okay, this is a Japanese template, so I should render based on the PMDA specifications, etc. So you can base it on the logic on the templates in use as well. There are some other methods around PDFA validation, checking that it's compliant with a certain compliance level of PDFA, and also extension option as well. So depending on the type of file, we could obviously render it slightly differently also. So this is some of the ways we can automate kind of some of the workflow, some option modules, if you like. And I'm going to focus on just use one example using the task data, leveraging some simple attributes of a DMS. So if I take an example DocShifter workflow, if I just zoom in a little bit on that, I'm just going to take a simple workflow where I'm monitoring a SharePoint repository in this case, and this would work equally whether this was any other DMS, whether that's a Kara repository, whether it's Documentum, whether it's Viva, whatever it may be, the same thing applies. You can monitor different repository types as well. And we're going to pull some metadata with it. And we're going to basically look at 5 different things. We're going to look to see whether or not an FDA flag has been set, whether an EMA flag has been set, a PMDA flag, Swissmedic, and an Health Canada check. So we're just going to look for a flag, basically. And if those flags have been set, we're then going to go through and actually create a rendition for that region. If the flag hasn't been set, we'll ignore it, and we won't create one for that region. It's a very simple mechanism, but ultimately very powerful, because each one of those configurations could be very different. You could have the FDA rendition could be quite different from the PMDA rendition, for example. So just looking at that a little bit, if I look at the check, all I'm doing is I'm monitoring an attribute. I just have to tell it which attribute and which route in my workflow I should take if that attribute or that flag is set to true in this case. If the FDA flag is true, I should take the FDA compliant route, which creates an FDA rendition. Same things apply in each of the other sort of elements on that same line. The PMDA check does the same thing, just looking for a PMDA flag and then creating a PMDA compliant rendition. As I say, if that's the case, just so you're aware what it's doing, in this case, it's looking in SharePoint, and we've just got some simple columns of info here. Again, in other DMSs, it would work in a similar way, just represented differently. But in here, I have a certain number of columns. I've just got an FDA, EMA, PMDA, CH, and HC flag. And they're basically just flags to decide whether or not I do or don't need a rendition for that region. But any attribute from any other repository works in the same way. So looking at then what would happen here if it's FDA and that was set to true, looking at the hi-fi options, I'll go into a lot more of the details of what other kinds of properties we can set on the PDF. But just focusing on one specific thing, just to highlight a difference between maybe US and Japanese submission to make a clear distinction between the two. In this case, I don't want to group my tables and figures. If I've got bookmarks created for my tables and figures in the PDF, I want them to just appear in the normal bookmark structure. Wherever they appeared in the document, I just want them to appear just like any other bookmark. So I'm not grouping, I'm not using the grouping mechanism for bookmarking. If I was to take the PMDA route, the Japanese route, in this case, I'm using a different configuration if this flag is set to true. In this case, same settings. The only difference here is I'm going to say I want to group my bookmarks. So I may be taking the exact same document and creating an FDA version with bookmarks done in one way, and for PMDA, same content, I could just have the same rendition exactly, but bookmarks with a grouped element at the end for tables and figures. So just to show you what that would be like, the US dossier, I may have some tables scattered throughout, and those tables in the bookmarks just appear throughout the structure as they normally would, that they would appear after whichever heading they were at within the document. In the case of the Japanese submission, the PMDA, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm grouping them at the end instead. So I'm taking those tables, not including them throughout the structure, grouping them at the end in a list of tables, and you can define how exactly that appears. So these are kind of the differences. The content is exactly the same. You're going to have two renditions, one with bookmarks set out according to the expectation from one health authority, and another one completely differently, potentially for another. Okay. Same thing with any of the other options, PDF version, etc. All of those things can be slightly different between them, depending on the expectation. So looking at some of the other settings, again, we've got kind of various configurations we can make. Obviously, a lot of detail around the bookmarking, the number of levels that are expected, how many bookmark heading levels should there be, how many levels should be visible when you open the PDF up. Same thing with configuration files. And Jesse asked the question, when you're bookmarking, what about if you've got custom styles in your templates? And again, you can set up mappings to say, as well as the default styles, your normal headings, and so on as well. You can also specify any custom styles in your own template to say, I also want to convert those to bookmarks automatically and at what level they should appear in the bookmark tree. So that's fully possible as well through a configuration file. You can also handle embedding files. If you've got files embedded in documents like Word, PDF, etc., you can decide how they should be embedded in the final output. You can do a lot of font handling. So again, Taufik and Maurizio both asked about embedding fonts, handling those. And whether it's a Word document or whether it's a PDF file, you can handle embedding of fonts, whether you want to embed all the fonts that are in use in the document, whether you just want a subset, whether you just want to do the non-standard fonts, etc. You can configure how exactly you want to embed the fonts. And again, they could be different health authority to health authority, although typically they're very similar. Other options around hyperlinking options, ways in which you can sort of make sure that your links are inherit zoom, whether that's for hyperlinks or bookmarks. And Taufik also asked about that. You can ensure that everything's set appropriately to inherit zoom. And your images, which typically shouldn't be compressed, you can compress if you need as well to save on space in draft versions, etc. And then the same thing, automating content preparation. You've got rejection handling, sort of making sure that files don't even get processed if certain things happen. And you can make sure that your track changes all appear consistently. Even if different authors have different settings, you can make sure that the rendition will always look exactly the same. The track changes will always look the same, no matter how they came from the different authors. You can also commit the reviews and remove comments, etc. as well. And various other options. I won't go through them all. Optimizing, initial view page layouts, etc. can all be configured here. So there's a lot of detail that you can set. And again, each of those can then be set within each individual country's configuration, fully automated. So what you get at the end is a fully technically compliant PDF for multiple health authorities through one single automated workflow. Obviously, a lot of the benefits to automating are obviously streamlining your process, accelerating that content preparation time, reducing the amount of checks, manual checks you're performing, making sure that you're able to achieve compliance earlier rather than post-publishing, only then having content that's truly technically ready to share with the health authority. Really achieving that quite a bit early in your process allows you to streamline things and save time later on with some of your checking. And identifying issues earlier, if you've got what you expect earlier in terms of compliance, you're able to begin checking earlier as well and identify those issues and fix them earlier. The whole idea is to try and aid if you've got, if you're aiming for simultaneous global submissions, it can obviously support that process extremely well as well. The whole idea, again, reduce manual steps. Anything that reduces manual steps is always going to reduce your risk. That's kind of where I want to leave it at this point is, really the final aim here is reducing risk and supporting that aim that most of us have, which is simultaneous global submissions. So again, I know that was a whirlwind 30 minutes, so apologies if I'm a minute or so late, but thanks everybody for your time, and I'll just pass back over to Gert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Paul, for presenting. We promised we would get you out of here on time, and we almost made it. There's one thing I'd like to ask all joiners. We have just 2 questions for you. It would be great if you could answer those. First one is really, are you interested to get in a deeper dive or a further conversation on this topic? Yes, no, or maybe at a later time. And then it would also be great if you could host the quality of, or if you could tell us more about the quality of our webinar. And with that, I think I'll give it a couple more seconds before we we close the poll. I want to again thank everybody for joining. We will make the recording available should you want to rewatch it. We have other webinars, prior webinars that are available for you to watch as well. And with that, Alp, again, thank you for organizing. The poll can be closed. I think we have now 65% people voted. Thank you for joining. Have a great rest of the day, evening, morning, or midday. And we hope to see you on one of our next webinars. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.